Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Filali, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. Over the past episodes, we have explored sport through many different perspectives. We looked at sports as a governance system, examining institutions, accountability, and athlete rights. We looked at sports as an economic ecosystem shaped by stakeholders, media, governments, and commercial interests. And in the previous episode, we stepped back to ask a more fundamental question. Why does sport matter? We explored how a simple game can become part of our identities, our cultures, and our communities. But if sports has this unique ability to bring people together, create meaning, and build connections, another question naturally follows. Can we intentionally use the power to create positive social change? Because today's sport is increasingly present as much more than competition. Around the world, organizations use sport to promote education, peace building, gender equality, inclusion, health, and community development. We often hear that sports has the power to change lives. But is that power automatic? Does sports create positive outcomes simply because people participate? Or does impact depend on how programs are designed, governed, and evaluated? Because behind every successful sport for development initiative, there are deeper questions. Who decides what communities need? How do we measure real impacts? How do we make sure projects empower people rather than simply producing good intentions? And how can sports become a serious tool within broader development strategies? This is where governance becomes essential. Sport for development isn't only about believing that sports can do good. It's about creating the structures, partnerships, and accountability mechanisms that allow sport to actually contribute to social change. To explore these questions, I am joined today by Dr. Ben Sanders, Executive Director of sportanddev, the international platform on sports and development. Through his work across research, policy, and practice, Ben has focused on connecting organizations, sharing knowledge, and strengthening the role of sport within sustainable development. Together, we will discuss the evolution of sport for development, the challenge of measuring impacts, questions of power and local ownership, and what the future of the sector could look like. Because ultimately, the question isn't whether sport can change the world. The question is under what conditions can it actually do so. Let's break it down. Thank you, Ben, for accepting to joining us today. And before discussing sports for development as a field, I would like to start with your own journey. You have worked across research, policy, and practice in sport for development. And today you are the executive director of sportanddev. What first convinced you that sports could be more than a competition and entertainment and become a tool for addressing broader social challenges?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me on the Sports Governance podcast. Nice to be here. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I always enjoyed sport and played a lot of sport when I was young. And, I guess it played an important part of my life. But I also grew up in Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, South Africa. So I guess I also had maybe a bit of a social conscience or, seeing the injustices in this part of the world. So was, thought about ways to get back. I didn't know that there was a field like sport for development in the beginning. And I only really found out about it, maybe 2006, 2007 or something. Yeah, and then decided that was a good way to marry my love for sport with the idea that you can use it in a positive way for society, and especially you can use it in a positive way for societies that need a lot of support and have been oppressed in the past, like what's happened in South Africa and other places. But yeah, it's not easy either. I will say that. I think like maybe nowadays it's a bit easier, but breaking into sport for development, many people reach out to me all the time asking this question: how do you get a job? How do you break in? And it isn't that easy because it's not a huge sector. There's not a lot of resources. It's often quite easy, I think, to do an internship or to volunteer, but to actually get a proper job and make a career, it's quite difficult. So I did my master's and my PhD, studied in this field, and then worked for the South African government for a while, worked for an NGO called Grassroots Soccer for a while, and then ended up consulting, for a range of different actors in sport and development, from the UN to Laureus to the Commonwealth, and then including sport and dev. And then for the last few years, I've been just focused full time on sport and dev. Yeah.
Okay, so Ben, sport is often described as a universal force for good, something that can promote peace, inclusion, development. But from your experience, is sports naturally a tool for positive social change, or does it depend on how it's designed and governed?
And yeah, it definitely depends on how it's designed and governed. I think that we need to be a bit more balanced and measured and realistic in how we think about sport. I think sport can do a lot of good or can contribute to a lot of good, but it can also do harm. And the way sport is organized, delivered, planned, monitored, is precisely what can make that difference. So you can have a sport program or an initiative or a sports governing body, that can reinforce gender inequalities in the world, like many sports do, or homophobia or exclusion. But you can also have a sports program, if it's well organized, that can challenge gender inequality, that can maybe empower women and girls. So it's definitely the way it's organized. And I think that also applies to the governance, right? I mean, a sports governing body can be well governed with transparency and accountability, but it can also be, as we see across the world right now, and with the World Cup, it can also be governed in a way that doesn't protect human rights or doesn't respect diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's definitely the way it's organized that's important. And last thing to say there, I mean, in many ways, sport is universal, it's sort of a universal language, but I also think that we are a little bit guilty of sort of just saying sport as if sport is one thing. And sport is made up of many different types of sport, not just, football versus hockey but there's elite sport, there's grassroots sport, and there's sport for people with disabilities, there's adapted sport. So, sport is not just one thing, it's not just singular. And I think the different forms of sport have different outcomes, So we see grassroots sport or sport for development, where I, focus my energy, is much more likely to contribute to health and well-being than elite sport, for example. And they're not exactly the same thing, even though there obviously are some parallels. But I think we need to stop speaking about sport as if it's one thing. When people say culture, we don't just think of one thing. And sport is similar. And it's the way sport is organized, and it's the form of sport it takes that can make that difference, as you suggested.
So the term sport for development, as you are using it yourself, is now used by governments, NGOs, and international organizations all around the world. But what does it actually mean in practice, and how has the field evolved from isolated community projects into a more structured global movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of different terms, and they're often used interchangeably. And, maybe at some point, the sport and development field should have a discussion about this. Sport for development. The UN says sport for development and peace, STP. Some people say sport for good, sport for social change. Really, I think it all boils down to the same thing, which is sport, using sport to serve society, to serve the needs of society, rather than, I think, society serving sport, which, as you know, I spoke to in that sporting dream. But sport should serve society and all of society, especially the most marginalized. So, there's a lot of different words and jargon and terms, but actually I think really all it is using sport for society's benefit, not for sporting benefit, not for excellence, not for medals, not for achievement, but using sport for goals and beyond the playing field. Which I actually think is the most important role sport can play. I'm much more interested, and I think we as a society should be much more interested and invested with resources in the role sport plays beyond the playing field, and the goals it can contribute to society, rather than the goals of sporting excellence, which I don't think serve society as well as community sport for all.
And one criticism sometimes directed at sport for development is that people assume positive outcomes simply because of projects involving sport. But how do we move from believing that sport creates impact to actually proving and measuring that impact?
Yeah, well, exactly. It's like ties back to what you raised earlier about the way sport is organized is important. I think, and I actually said this on another podcast I was in with Erica Muller-Chen, who works for this, who's a sport for development expert, and it was all about what I was saying. We must stop being evangelical about sport and sport for development. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve every single problem in the world. It can do harm, like we said, if it's not organized in the right way. Sport itself is not automatically positive, and it's not automatically negative. It's the way it's used that is important. And I think that actually all the evangelism around the power of sport and that sport builds bridges. I mean, sport can build bridges. Sport can change communities, but it doesn't automatically. And I actually think that being so evangelical about sport actually undermines sport for development, because people who are very serious about development, and especially those outside of sport, will look at sport and go, well, does sport automatically make a positive difference? I mean, look what's happening with mega events or sport governing bodies. Look what's happening with human rights in sport. So I think we need to be a bit more like self-critical and look at this, not because sport can't do a lot of good, it can, but we need to be critical if we want to move forward. And I think we need to stop being evangelical about sport.
Well, when we talk about sports governance, we often focus on international federations, competition, and elite sports. But when sport is used for development, who is actually responsible for governance and accountability? Is it NGOs, governments, sports organizations, the funders, or the community themselves?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I guess sport for development can be used by a wide range of actors, right? So each actor will have their own governance processes, whether they're a UN agency or a government or an NGO or a university doing research. So they'll all have their own governance, or should have their own governance processes, and have good governance. And of course, sometimes they're working in partnership together as well, which also requires a certain level of governance. So, it depends on the wide variety of actors. I think that, there's an idea that sort of sport belongs to the federations, but I don't agree with that. I think sport belongs to the people. No one entity owns football or basketball, the federations or the governing bodies are important, but there's so many informal actors, from NGOs just to participants to people, who are often neglected and don't have much of a say in what happens in the sport they love or play or manage or participate in. And I do think that just on the subject of governance, I mean, there's a long way to go when we look at, especially among major sporting bodies, what the need for greater accountability and transparency. And also within probably some of the NGOs and civil society actors. I do think while governments, UN agencies and sporting bodies have played an important role, a lot of the sport for development work and a lot of the innovation and stuff has been through civil society and NGOs, who have sort of often worked on the ground close to communities with little resources. And I think their contribution is really important in sport for development, and should probably also be better recognized, because they're the ones often delivering the programs rather than big, grand policy statements. And both are important. But, we need policy and we need practice.
If we move to power dynamics, you have previously highlighted the need for a more equitable sport for development sector. Historically, many development projects have been designed or funded by organizations from the global north. So how do we make sure that sport for development empowers local communities rather than reproducing unequal power dynamics?
Yeah, it's a great question and something I'm very committed to.
Yes.
I run a global organization, as you know, the International Platform on Sport and Development, sportanddev.org, but I'm based in South Africa, right? And so many people think I must be based in Europe, because I run a global organization. My response is, well, why? Why should one be based in the global north? Or why can't we have global organizations led from the global south, especially when the development needs are greater in this part of the world? And in fact, many of the best sport for development programs are in this part of the world. And so we do need locally owned things. The world is too north-driven. I don't think sport can solve that entirely. The world is north-driven, not just when it comes to sport and sport for development, but we can look in the mirror and have more locally owned projects, more from not just projects, from research to policies, coming from the global south. Too many decisions are made in boardrooms in, New York and Geneva that are very far away from, from where the developmental needs are often. And that needs to change. The role of organizations in the global south needs to improve, and not just delivering programs, doing research, policies, debates, influence. And so that's one reason why at sportanddev.org, we now have our platform in 4 UN languages: English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. So more voices from the Middle East, from Latin America, from Francophone Africa, because the sector is not only North-driven, it's also Anglo-centric. And so, of course, there are many more languages. Those are 4 of the 6 UN languages, and we're a small team, so we can't do it all. But, all of these things are really important because there often aren't even tools or resources for people in their own language, which again limits their ability to influence the debate and get involved. So there's a lot of structural issues we need to tackle. And I think you raised a good point. There's a lot of individual benefits of sport and sport for development, but we need to also look at the structures, even if there are good intentions behind some of the work and policies. And we need to be careful that we don't just reinforce the structures which, cause the problems we're trying to solve in the first place. And I wrote an article about this once called an own goal in sport for development. We don't mean to score an own goal, but if we keep just reinforcing the power structures and systems without questioning them or challenging them, then to a certain extent we are scoring an own goal, not intentional. And I think this is why, despite all the good work that's happened in sport for development, we still see so many inequalities, because a lot of good work has happened with specific programs or specific organizations in specific places, but not enough work has been done on the social justice front to say, let's challenge the power structures, governance structures that oversee sport or sport for development. So a bit of a long answer, but I think it's really important to think about who's making the decisions and where the power lies, and that sport can play a role in changing that. Even if we can't change the whole world, we can make sport at least more balanced, less north-driven, more inclusive, etc.
Moving on to sustainable development goals. Sport is recognized as an enabler of sustainable development, but it doesn't have its own dedicated SDG or target or indicator. Does it limit the influence of sport in global development policy? And what role should sport have beyond the 2030 agenda?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the fact that sport's recognized in the SDGs paragraph 37 as an enabler of development is good. It's galvanized a lot of work. It's also provided a common framework for actors to work under. And so that's important. And it has, it's also allowed sport to be adopted more by those outside of sport, which I think is actually more important than those inside sport who already believe in sport. But I think, I think we also do need to go further. What you said is true. I often say this, there are no binding commitments to using sport. There are no goals, there are no targets, there are no indicators for sport in the 2030 agenda. And in the next set of global goals, I think we should be a bit more ambitious around the scope of sport. Of course, sport that doesn't necessarily mean there will be a specific goal on sport, but is sport recognized more as a cross-cutting mechanism to help achieve other goals? Is the use of sport and physical activity recognized more as a means to contribute to health and reduce health costs and tackle NCDs? Is that more explicit? That levels of physical activity, for example, are maybe an indicator or a target. So I think we need to be more ambitious moving forward in the way sport is recognized. I think it has helped having it in the SDGs and also other frameworks like the African Union agenda and other frameworks that recognize the role of sport. But I think, I would hope that we can go further when it comes to the next set of global goals and policies.
Today, the sport of development sector includes a good number of organizations working across different countries and issues from peace building to gender equality and health. In such a fragmented ecosystem, what role can platforms like sportanddev play in connecting knowledge, organizations, and communities?
Yeah, I mean, that's in a way why sportanddev, the international platform on sport and development, exists. Because it is such a diverse sector. And in a way, it will always be a diverse sector, which is both a challenge and an opportunity, right? Because it's sport for development, right? So that means you could be working in public health. You could be working in crime prevention using sport. You could be working in gender equality. So you're working in all these different sectors. There's a wide range of approaches and sports used. So it's going to be diverse, right? Some people are using football for HIV prevention. Some people are using surfing for mental health. Some organizations are using martial arts for violence prevention. So I think that, that diversity is good, but to coordinate that all is difficult, especially because it cuts across sectors, it cuts across sports, it cuts across approaches. And it's not just sport. It's sport with non-sporting components. It's sport with conversations and life skills and messaging that is just as important, actually, those non-sport components in sport for development. And so when the sector started to emerge, I guess, coming back to the way we started off in 2003, even though sport has often been used for society ever since the ancient Olympics, but when the sport for development sector really started to emerge on the radar in 2003, with the MDGs and these conferences, that's how sportanddev was born, actually, because the UN and many actors, they said we need a database, we need a coordination mechanism for the sector, because it was even less coordinated back then, right? No one knew who was doing what, where, how, why. So that's how sportanddev.org was born. It originally very simple, like a database of organizations. And now it's evolved along with the sector in a way. So in a way, we're a product of the sport for development sector and an asset, or the leading global hub for people to use. And then over the years, we've evolved. So now we have a whole wide range of information, news. There's over 10,000 news articles on sportanddev, jobs, opportunities, events, research, and learning. Important, as we spoke about, especially because sport is critiqued, sport for development is critiqued for not having enough research and learning. So we've evolved from just being this database to now sharing information, to capacity building, providing a lot of tools and resources. We run this massive open online course that you might know about, this MOOC, which is freely available. And everything is open access because we don't believe that knowledge should be behind a paywall. So all our tools, resources are free in those 4 UN languages: English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. And we do have evidence that this transcends the website, the online. People are using information on Sport and Dev in their projects or programs, in their policies at the grassroots level, at the governmental level. They're applying it in their work, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how we were born, and the need that kick-started Sport and Dev over 20 years ago. And in a way, that need is still there. Obviously, it's evolved, and so has the platform. But there is still a need to coordinate the diverse sector and a sector that often, and tends to operate in silos, with a lot of diverse actors, because the sport for development sector is not just sports organizations, and it's not just what people think of as sport for development organizations. It's anyone using sport for development. The UN Refugee Agency are on our board. They are using sport for development. The Commonwealth are on our board. They're using sport for development in policies. So it's not just a small range. In fact, I think there's a huge range of actors that use sport for society or for development, both in sport and beyond sport. And that's who we look to serve, all of them, regardless of, where they come from.
Looking ahead 10 or even 20 years, what would a more mature sport for development sector look like? What needs to change for sport to move from being seen as a nice addition to becoming a serious tool within global development strategies?
Good question. That's also what drives a lot of our work and my work, I guess, is...
Because if I remember well, you have a sporting dream.
Yes, exactly. I wrote some of this before in a sporting dream. I think that there's a long way to go. I think we've done well. We've come far. We should recognize the progress. But, as Nelson Mandela said, I've discovered that the secret after climbing a great hill is there are many more hills left to climb. So there's still a long way to go. I think, if we think that, say, sport for development started becoming formalized as a movement or sector from 2003, and that's when Sport and Dev.org was born. We're like kind of a young adult now, right? In a way. And I think that's sort of reflected in where we are. And we need to move forward, We were an adolescent, we were a young adult, we're maturing, we're growing, but we need to keep doing that. We need to keep being critical of the role of sport, using evidence, not evangelism, to guide us, looking at the areas where sport can make a difference. Looking at the research, what it says, what it doesn't say, where are the gaps, where are the opportunities. We know sport can play a big role in promoting health. We know sport can, and we should be making these cases and probably making those cases with, real evidence, and probably speaking in the language that people want to hear. How much money does sport save in the public health system? There's a cost of investing in sport, but I guess what is the cost of not investing in sport and physical activity? Physical activity is the fourth leading cause of premature mortality, right, in the world. So I think we need to start making a case with real evidence and robust evidence to show why we should invest in sport. And there, I think we also need to be clever. What type of sport should we invest in? I think, as I said in my sporting dream, we should invest in grassroots sport, sport for all, sport for everyone, because the research shows that those investments are more likely to be beneficial for community health and well-being in society. So we need to look at the evidence, we need to follow it, but I think we also need to advocate and make the case that sport should not all be about big sport or serious sport or elite sport, but actually the best investments in sport, I think, will be in grassroots and community sport. And that's what the evidence shows. And the evidence has shown that for a long time. So part of it is using the evidence, but I think another part of it is advocating and saying, actually, we need to reform the way sport is organized, funded, and invested so that it better serves all of society. And yes, resources are constrained, but resources are also not constrained in many ways when we look at the vast resources in sport. They're just not very well distributed. And so governments, I think, should be putting most of their sporting budgets to community sport, to grassroots sport. And because that's where I think we will see the real return on investment for society.
Finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Ben, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Um,
My signature closing question.
okay, yes. Yeah, I mean, I think governance is critical, right? And I mean, I think again, when we think of governance in sport, we often make the mistake of just thinking about sport governing bodies. But actually, governance applies to anything, right? An NGO, a school, a sports team. There's all governance structures and procedures in these. And good governance is so important. I mean, the way, who governs, how things are governed, are so critical to the way things work. This ties into what we've been speaking about. The world is in a way north-driven or governed by the global north more than it should be. And with a history of colonialism, exploitation, all of these things which persist today. The sports sector, I would say, is overly governed by these big federations and associations when sport really belongs to everyone. And so, the good governance and sports governance really has a long way to go. And I think the good, governance, I would say accountability, transparency, integrity, and I would probably add diversity, equity, and inclusion in there as all facets of governance that we should be taking into account. Another thing I think is really important and is quite unique to sport is we need to understand that good governance should come first, I think. People talk about the autonomy of sport. We don't want people interfering in sport, but sport should be subject to the same checks and balances as any other public good. Why not? I mean, we have a situation in sport where the sport governing bodies, they police themselves. And actually, I mean, that's quite crazy when you think about it. I mean, imagine if you run an organization and something comes up and then you decide, well, we'll just do our own investigation. We won't call the police. We'll just do our own investigation. So I think sport should be subject to the same checks and balances. Sport governing bodies shouldn't play policeman and prosecutor at the same time. We need more regulation of sport and within reason. And we also need better governance, not just in the sport governing bodies where there are many, many issues, but also within sport for development and peace organizations. As well, we need greater female leadership, for example. There's lots of things we need. But good governance should be a prerequisite for any organization or entity working in this space, from safeguarding to financial transparency and so on.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. Today's conversation started with a simple question. Can sport really change the world? And maybe the answer is more complex than the statements we often hear. Because throughout this discussion, one idea became clear. Sports itself isn't automatically a force for good. A ball, a competition, or a program doesn't create social change by itself. Sports can include, but it can also exclude. It can challenge inequalities, but it can also reproduce them. What matters is how sports is designed, governed, and delivered. With Ben, we explored how the sport for development movement has evolved from individual projects into a broader global ecosystem. But we also discussed why good intentions aren't enough. If sport wants to be taken seriously as a tool for development, it needs evidence, accountability, transparency, and a willingness to question itself. Because believing in the power of sport shouldn't mean avoiding criticism. It means asking the difficult questions that allow sport to become better. Who makes decisions? Whose voices are represented? Are communities truly empowered? And are resources going where they can create the greatest impact? Perhaps one of the most important ideas from this conversation is that sport shouldn't exist solely for itself. The ultimate objective isn't simply more competitions, more medals, or more growth. It's understanding how sports can serve people, communities, and society. And it requires rethinking the systems behind sports. Who governs it, who benefits from it, and how we measure its value. Because ultimately the question isn't whether sport has the potential to change the world, The real question is whether we are willing to create the structures, governance, and conditions that allow that potential to become reality. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn if you found this useful. You are listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Filali. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Today's conversation started with a simple question. Can sport really change the world? And maybe the answer is more complex than the statements we often hear. Because throughout this discussion, one idea became clear. Sports itself isn't automatically a force for good. A ball, a competition, or a program doesn't create social change by itself. Sports can include, but it can also exclude. It can challenge inequalities, but it can also reproduce them. What matters is how sports is designed, governed, and delivered. With Ben, we explored how the Sport for Development movement has evolved from individual projects into a broader global ecosystem. But we also discussed why good intentions aren't enough. If sport wants to be taken seriously as a tool for development, it needs evidence, accountability, transparency, and a willingness to question itself. Because believing in the power of sport shouldn't mean avoiding criticism. It means asking the difficult questions that allow sport to become better. Who makes decisions? Whose voices are represented? Are communities truly empowered? And our resources go in where they can create the greatest impact. Perhaps one of the most important ideas from this conversation is that sport shouldn't exist only for itself. The ultimate objective isn't simply more competitions, more medals, or more growth. It's understanding how sports can serve people, communities, and society. And it requires rethinking the systems behind sports. Who governs it, who benefits from it, and how we measure its value. Because ultimately the question isn't whether sport has the potential to change the world. The real question is whether we are willing to create the structures, governance, and conditions that allow that potential to become reality. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn if you found this useful. You are listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Younes Filali. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.